Good morning, Ashley. Are we good to go?
Yes, we are.
Awesome. Okay, it's 11:15 according to all my watches. So I'm gonna get us going here. I'm gonna call the Public Works and Mobility Committee to order. I think that's what we're called now. I can't remember. If we could put that information up, great. Thank you so much. For anyone wanting to participate in these meetings, we continue to meet virtually, and there's information on how to join and access to our agendas on the city's website under the meetings tab. You can always call City Council and leave a voicemail by calling 406-552-6012, and you can email us at council@ci.missoula.mt.us and provide public comment that way. If you are in the public and want to provide comment during this meeting, I will do my best to make sure that we can acknowledge your presence and wanting to provide comment. Okay, with that, if we could do a roll call for attendance, Ashley, please.
Anderson. Becerra.
Present.
Carlino.
Present.
Contos.
Still here.
Hess.
Present.
Jones. Jordan.
Present.
Nugent. Savage. Cheryl.
Present.
Vasika.
Present.
West.
Present.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And we have minutes to approve from April 20th. Are there any changes to those minutes? Okay, see none, those will stand approved, and we will do a quick check to see if we have any public in attendance to provide public comment, and I don't see anyone. So with that, we will move to our first item of business, and that is a construction services agreement with Camp Well Drilling and Pump Service for the Summer Street well pump replacement. And Jerry Ellis is here to present. Go ahead, Jerry. Jerry, can you hear? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, having some difficulties here. Yeah, so we had a well fail on us out in East Missoula. We need to replace it. It's basically just a pump that was in hole out there. It's one of the few wells we have out there. We really are hoping to get it replaced and back down hole soon before irrigation season starts. So we're asking for, I believe, I don't see it right in front of me, but I think it's $38,400 or $28,400 to replace the pump and some of the piping that feeds that pump. The pump was installed in '96, so we got plenty of life out of it. And it really is the most efficient pump that we can find on the market right now to put back in hole. This will be funded out of the Water Enterprise Fund, and we do have money in the professional services fund. We anticipate 2, 3, 4 of these every year. It's not at all uncommon for us to have this happen. So we do have 40+ wells. That's what feeds all the water to the city. So you know, we try to get as much time out of these as possible. But what happens is eventually, as they start to wear out, they'll start losing productivity, and at some point they get to where they're just no longer efficient to keep running, and that's where we were with this one.
Great, thanks, Jerry. You read my mind. I was going to ask where the funding's coming. Thank you. John, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. When you say a pump fails, I'm just curious, what does that really mean? Is it leaking, or are there parts that fail within the pump?
Yeah, so most of our downhole pumps, they have 6, 8 stages in them, meaning that they have 6 or 8 impellers in them in different bowls. And when you run them over time, those impellers start to get wore out, and pretty soon they won't push as much water as they used to. Some of the water will get by on the sides of the impellers, and when it gets to the point to where they're wore out too much, they won't pump hardly any water at all. And that's what I mean. You know, they eventually just I always say they cratered, or they gave up the ghost. They just quit working, and you can see it. We have SCADA at every one of our sites. We can see how much water they're pumping at any time, any given minute. And so when we're just randomly going through and looking at these things, we can start telling that they're not producing as much water as they used to last month. We can look at last year and the year before and see if it's been an ongoing thing for us. And you know, we'll check valves, we'll check anything else we can to see if there's something else causing the issue. But once again, it's not at all uncommon for it to be the pump that's just wearing out.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Amber.
I was just going to say that I'm happy to make the recommended motion.
Great. Appreciate that. We have a motion on the floor. Any questions? And still no public to provide public comment. So with that, we will take a roll call vote, please, Ashley.
Becerra,
Yes.
Carlino,
Yes.
Contos,
Yes.
Hess,
Yes.
Jordan,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Vasika,
Yes.
West,
Yes.
and Jones.
Yes.
Okay, that is 9 yeses and 0 nos.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Jerry. And this will be on our consent agenda.
Thank you, everybody.
And next we have a professional services agreement with DJNA for the, nope, I'm moving too fast here. Number 2 is the Mullen Build right-of-way agreement with the Dougherty Ranch LLC, and Jeremy Keene is here to provide information.
Okay, good morning. Jeremy Keene, Director for Public Works and Mobility. I have a right-of-way agreement for your approval for the mayor to sign. This is another piece of the Mullen Build project. You've seen several of these before. This one was lingering behind. It's some right-of-way that we actually don't need right away, but will help for future phases of the project, and will also make construction of the current project easier and allow room for utilities, for other private utilities to go in. So what this pertains to is right-of-way along England Boulevard. The New England Boulevard, starting at Flynn Lane and going west, and then continuing out just about to where it connects with George Elmer Drive. And all we're getting here is we're getting an additional 5 feet of public right-of-way easement on the outside of the existing 80-foot right-of-way. And then we're also getting a temporary construction easement to allow for grading work and construction activities to occur. So it's a good step to get that in place, and it will help with future portions of the project. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Jeremy. Any questions from council? I don't see any. We do need a,
I think I was racing Jordan there. I don't have any questions. I'm just happy to make the recommended motion for this as well.
great, thanks. So we have a motion on the floor, still no public to provide public comment. I'll just say that this is one more step that's needed in order to make all the work that needs to happen in this area possible if needed and when needed. So it's a proactive way of ensuring that we meet our goals. And I appreciate that and support it. So with that, if we can take a roll call vote, please, Ashley.
Becerra,
Yes.
Carlino,
Yes.
Contos,
Yes.
Hess,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
Jordan,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Vasika,
Yes.
West.
Yes.
Okay, that is 9 yeses and 0 nos.
Great. So that too will be on our consent agenda. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you all.
And now we have a professional services agreement with DJ&A for the Grand Creek Waterway Realignment Project. And Andy is here to present.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Andy Schultz, city engineer for utilities. Appreciate you guys having me. I know it's a long day for y'all. So I'm here to ask for authorization for professional services agreement with DJ&A. Share my screen. So this is for the Grant Creek realignment projects. This project, it's going to relocate a portion of Grant Creek south of West Broadway, known as the Horseshoe Bend. So in 2021, the city applied for and received an ARPA water and sewer competitive grant in the amount of $910,296 for this specific project. This project was initially a part of the Mullen bill grant, but it was deferred until additional funding could be acquired. So now that we have that ARPA funding, DJ&A and their subconsultant HDR have submitted the scope and budget to design this realignment. So it's approximately a mile of Grant Creek that will be realigned. It's going to basically take a big portion of this area is in the floodplain. So this will remove it from the floodplain and contain it within a riparian area, like a defined floodplain along the creek itself. And it'll also have a stream channel that will be capable of carrying kind of the base flow that we see. And so we'll also include design of a shared use path around it. At the same time, we'll negotiate for right of way for George Elmer and the future north extension of George Elmer, where it will connect to West Broadway. And also take a look at how George Elmer will cross this realigned Grant Creek as part of it. We're also looking into stormwater relocations and some flood control swales out there. So the DJ&A's budget for the design through the bidding of this project is $331,871. And so this will be funded via that ARPA competitive grant, but that grant also requires a 1-to-1 match. So it will be that 1-to-1 match will be funded as part of the Grant Creek Trail restoration portion of the Setupcane Area Transportation Special Impact Fee. Happy to take any questions.
Couldn't unmute. Thanks, Andy. Amber.
Yeah, thanks. Andy, if I missed this, I'm sorry, but as you're doing the realignment of the creek, are there any plans for kind of planting along that? I mean, you always worry about water getting really hot.
Yeah, oh, for sure. The portion of it is to establish a robust riparian area. So basically we'll have a defined floodplain. So we'll kind of have that base flow channel, and then that defined floodplain will essentially be a riparian area that will, as part of this, will be restored with, I'm sure, thousands of plantings.
I know that shade's really important for our water. I would be happy to make the recommended motion.
Great, thank you, Amber. And yeah, I think there's a group, the Grand Creek Restoration team or group or committee that's been working in parallel to this to ensure that it's restored in a way that is compatible with requirements and the needs for a healthy riparian ecosystem. So yeah, this is one part of that piece of that puzzle. I don't see anyone in attendance from the public to provide comments. So with that, If we can take a roll call vote, please, Ashley.
Sarah,
Yes.
Carlino,
Yes.
Contos,
Yes.
Hess,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
Jordan,
Yes.
Cheryl, Vasika,
Yes.
West.
Yes.
Okay, and that's 9 yeses and 0 nos.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Thank you, Andy. And this too will be on our consent agenda. And we have, so as part of Public Works presentations to City Council, these are informational presentations to give council an opportunity to get a more in-depth look at how at all the work that happens in Public Works and mobility, and how that is part of the larger picture for city operations. We have one more presentation, and today we have transportation planning and funding, and Aaron Wilson is here to present. Take it away, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. And if I'm not correct, I have an hour and 15 minutes of your time to talk about transportation today. This is great.
Yes.
I feel like usually I'm racing for time and trying to get through everything. So hopefully this will be a good opportunity to spend a little bit of time. I've got really an overview presentation to talk about a number of different aspects of what we do in transportation planning. And including an overview of the MPO, because that's related to sort of the development of projects and planning and funding. And I think it's important to understand. And then some aspects of how we develop projects and get them funded. So I think it's a good overview as you all are going into budget season. We're going into construction season. There's just a lot that's going to be happening. And some of this might be review for those of you who have been on council for a while, but it's always a good idea to come back and make sure we're all understanding the same issues that we deal with in transportation. So I've got a little bit of a slideshow, and we have plenty of time, I think. So we should have lots of opportunity for discussion. And as I'm going through this, definitely feel free to stop me, or if you have specific questions. And then as I get through this and we get to conversation at the end, if there are any pieces of this that you want to discuss in more depth, there's certainly always more detail that we can go into and have maybe more of a conversation, or if there are specific questions that come out of this, let me know. I'm always happy to come and do a presentation or have a conversation, because all of this stuff is not easy and it is not simple, despite our best efforts to try to make it that way. So let me see if I can get this going. There we go. All right, so in this presentation, as I mentioned, I'll start with a bit of an overview of what the MPO is, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, because that's an aspect of transportation planning that I think is not always very well understood, and how it relates to the city, I think is maybe the most important. So I'll talk a little bit about the city's role in the MPO and what that means. And then as we get into talking about projects and funding, I'll start with an overview of how we prioritize projects. So how do we get to the point where we're actually thinking about funding a project? And then as we start to fund projects, how do we develop those from sort of a concept of a line on a map that we know we've got this need here? How do we go from that point to where we have a final constructed project? And then I've got some slides on how we manage the funding side of it. So what does our funding picture look like? What are the funding sources? Sort of some of those issues that we're facing around how do we actually get this work done? So hopefully there's some disparate elements here, but my hope is that this will give a good overview of kind of the process of going from these ideas of what our community needs are all the way through construction of transportation improvements. So to start off with, what is the Metropolitan Planning Organization? This is something that I think it's always good to come back to and talk about because it's a little bit esoteric and sort of bureaucratic from the federal government. But in Missoula, the Metropolitan Planning Organization has been around since the early 1980s. It is a federally mandated aspect of our transportation planning that all urban areas in the United States over 50,000 people are required to have a metropolitan planning organization to ensure that we are coordinating and thinking regionally about our transportation issues in those urban areas. And so that happened for Missoula in the 1980 census. Took a couple of years to get up and running, but we have been operating as an MPO since about 1983. Some minor details that I think are related to the MPO, but not so much important about how we do our actual work, is that Planning Board is the officially designated MPO as a regional planning organization that has a state designated entity that is responsible for regional planning. We've had a lot of conversations over the years about who or what or how we designate the MPO, but this has been the case since the 80s and it seems to work well. It was done through an agreement with the governor of the state of Montana. And so that's how we operate in terms of the designation of the MPO. That said, governance of the MPO and all the decision-making happens through TPCC and TTAC, two acronyms that you will likely hear a lot from us. That's the Transportation Policy Coordinating Committee, which is our overall governing board. And I'll get into the membership of that in a minute. And then the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee, which is our staff level group of folks from the city, the county, MDT. Again, I'll go through some of that membership, but TTAC advises TPCC on decisions and really allows us to have some vetting of all of our planning and our work before we go to our governing board for decision making. Also want to point out that a key element of the MPO as it is set up today is that the city is the official sort of administrator of the MPO. So all of our staff and our funding is all administered by the city, but that doesn't necessarily mean the city is making all the decisions. That still resides in TTAC and TPCC, but the city manages our contracts, our staff, our city employees. And that has been the case for about the last 10 years when the Office of Planning and Grants, which was a joint city-county office, was dissolved. And we have sort of gone through a number of reorganizations, but now we're in Public Works and Mobility, but our work is really regional. So thinking about sort of the responsibilities of the MPO includes all of the city of Missoula, and there are two sort of key boundaries. One is our planning boundary, which is this line in orange here. That is the area that we are looking at when we're doing transportation planning. And then the urbanized area, which is this blue color, that is where we are programming federal transportation dollars. So that's really our boundary of what the MPO is. That's the urban area for Missoula. But then we're including this whole planning area when we're looking at how we need to address our regional transportation system. There are a number of members of the MPO that are key, that are required to be partners in this planning activity. Those include the city of Missoula, Missoula County, the Montana Department of Transportation, and the Missoula Urban Transportation District or Mountain Line. So those are the key partners where we're looking at all the federal funding within that urban area for all of these partners. The structure of our committees, as I mentioned, we have two. TPCC is our governing board. It's made up of primarily elected officials and other representatives. We have MUTD board member on that. That's so represent the transit side. We have our MDT representative from the district office. We have state and federal highway representatives from MDT and FHWA. And then we have one city council representative, which is currently Mirta, and then the mayor sits on TPCC. And then we have two county commissioners to sort of get that split of the city and the county and make sure we are coordinating. And then TTAC, as I said, is staff level, and we try to have as much representation as we can from all the various departments and staff who work on transportation issues. So it includes public works staff, it includes used to be Development Services, but now is CPDI. We have MRA, County and City Parks and Trails, MDT, just a whole host of folks who can give us good input on ensuring we're coordinating appropriately around transportation. So this is sort of the governing structure of the MPO. Again, the city has a role in this, both at a staff level and at an elected official and governing board. But we're also working with the county and the state and Mountain Line for all the work that we do. So it's a little complicated, but fairly straightforward. Maybe what's most important for council is to think about what the city's role in the MPO is. And as I said, the city is a member of the MPO as the primary city in the urbanized area. That the city of Missoula is required to be part of the MPO, has membership and representation on both of our committees. So the city also does our administrative management. So this includes our contract approval. So when we bring contracts through for planning projects that are using our federal PL dollars, those are the federal transportation planning dollars that we get as a region to do integrated transportation planning. City council is responsible for approving those contracts, but it's still TTAC and TPCC who are making the decision around what those funds go to, how we're doing those planning processes. It's really just an administrative approval that city council has to manage that contract, because all of those PL funds get reimbursed to the city. So the city's managing the dollar side of it, but not the programming and decision-making about how we use those funds. So that'll be important as you go into budget season and you see my division's budget and looking at some of those funds in our budgets are really set by our federal work plan and use of those PL funds, and TPCC approves those, but city council has to approve the budget because those all go through the city as the administrative manager of that. So I think it's sort of a key point that the city is managing the day-to-day sort of administrative side of the MPO, but not the decision-making and programming of what we do. And then finally, the city is a really key plan implementer. So when we get into looking at funding sources and project prioritization, the city has a key role in making sure we're implementing our regional transportation plan. And so that means how we're using our local transportation dollars in project prioritization, and deciding what projects are moving forward for funding. So again, really key role that the city plays in the MPO. So the work that the MPO does, again, we've done a lot of presentations on this. It's just kind of a reminder as we get into our project prioritization and funding. But the key tasks that the MPO does are the long-range transportation plan, which we've talked a lot about. This is a regional plan, but again, the city is really the key partner, one of the key partners in implementing our goals, our project funding, and really making that plan a reality. We also have the Transportation Improvement Program, and so that is how we program and allocate federal dollars to transportation projects within the urbanized area. And so that's a key role of the MPO. Any federal transportation dollars that come to Missoula have to go through the MPO to approve. And again, the city has a role in that process, but the MPO as a whole is really making those decisions. And then finally, we have infrastructure plans like our bicycle facilities master plan, our pedestrian facilities master plan. We have a safety plan. All these sort of sub-plans that the MPO works on really serve the purpose of providing that level of planning for the city as well. We don't necessarily have a lot of dedicated city-specific transportation planning, which I think at a region of our size is really key, that decisions the city makes has a really big impact on the region and vice versa. So those two things should and are very well integrated. And then finally, to the MPO, we have those transportation planning funds. Those go to things like updating our long range plan, doing those infrastructure plans. We do a lot of partnerships. So we contribute to the downtown master plan. We're contributing to the midtown master plan to make sure we have really integrated transportation planning across all of those efforts. And then, we're always drawing on all these, what we call contributing plans. So thinking about our affordable housing policy or our growth policy at the city level, all of those things influence what we do at the MPO level. So there's, I think, really good integration of our transportation into those other plans and vice versa. And really that's the role of the MPO. at its core is to ensure that we have good coordinated transportation planning. So kind of the last piece I want to talk about is the goals, the transportation goals that we have set through our long range transportation plan that influence all of the rest of our decision making. So these are really the key aspects of what we're focused on in transportation. And it's not just looking at what are we going to fund and what are the specific transportation improvements, but it's trying to be much more multidisciplinary, knowing that transportation is essentially like the circulatory system of the city. It's a good indicator of the health of the city. It's how well we function. It really is critical and central to everything else that we do. And that may be part just my opinion as a transportation planner, but I think when you look at all of the things that are going on in our region, transportation is such a central element to all of that. So the goals, we have 5 primary goals in our long range plan. Those include focusing on safety and promoting health and a good quality of life for the region. We want to advance sustainability and community resilience. So our transportation funding decisions really play into how sustainable and resilient our community is in the face of climate change and all of the other various changing aspects. Sustainability isn't just environmental sustainability, it's thinking about economic and social sustainability as well. And then we want to expand mobility choices. So making sure that people have adequate and efficient ways to travel, regardless of which mode they are choosing. And then we want to connect and strengthen communities across the region. So that means not just focusing in the downtown, but how do we connect all of the parts of Missoula together with a high quality transportation system. Then finally, one of the pieces that we're not always thinking about when we're looking at what we're constructing for new projects, but making sure that we can maintain and invest strategically in our assets. So we're not just building out new infrastructure, but we're maintaining what we have, and that our decisions around transportation ensures that we can do that in the future and make sure that we can continue to have an economically vital region. So 5 key goals. I won't come back to these too much, but you'll see sort of how these are reflected in our other decision-making processes as we get into project prioritization and how we work with our limited funding. So that gets us into project prioritization. So the next step after we do all this long-range planning is looking at what do we want to do next? What are our highest priority projects, and how do we determine what those are? That is not just a reactive, we hear of a problem and we jump at trying to create a project, but really thinking strategically about what are all the trade-offs of if we fund one project, we're not funding 50 others, and how do we make that decision effectively so that we are advancing those key goals that we have in the long-range transportation plan. So briefly, in the long-range plan does this at a regional scale, and so we have a process that we've gone through in the long-range plan. We update that every 4 or 5 years. It's a good opportunity to reflect on how things are changing, what we've gotten done, what resources we have available, and really take a process that is data-driven. So we want to be looking at all of the data and indicators and changes that we're seeing in a region and have that reflected in what we're prioritizing. It should be values-based, so making sure we're looking at those goals and how are each of these projects that we might fund advancing any one of those goals. So a good example is equity, that's something that is a value-based decision-making, that we can make investments that help address inequity in our region. And that's a really key aspect of both the long-range plan and what we're doing as a city in our transportation investments. And then we want to really focus on outcomes. So what are we getting out of these projects? It's not just addressing an existing need, but looking towards the future and how are we accommodating growth? How are we addressing some of our challenges in the community, and what are the outcomes that we'll get out of each project? It's really, really important to look at that. And then it's important to be comprehensive, that we're not just looking at one specific location and those challenges, but how does that one project influence all of the rest of the projects in the region? So, one way to think about that is if we do a roadway expansion project on a mile of road, that may be addressing a very localized issue, but that's not addressing congestion throughout the rest of the region. So you may accommodate more vehicles on a particular stretch of road, but then once you get into those vehicles get into the rest of the network, you haven't really addressed that issue. And so there's opportunity to look in the long range plan how we're addressing this regionally and comprehensive, so that all those investments work together to get us towards those goals that we have. And we went through a process in the long range plan. For those of you who were here over the last couple of years, we just wrapped this up last June, so about a year ago. And we went through several steps of identifying all of the, what are all of the projects we could fund, screening those for appropriate projects that are appropriate to put in a long range plan, scoring those against various metrics related to our goals. We're assessing some various scenarios of different combinations of projects and looking at what those outcomes are based on those scenarios. And then starting to prioritize projects based on the available funding in any given time period. So we have near term, midterm, and long-term projects, but based on those scenarios and the scoring, trying to figure out how we get our highest impact projects funded as quickly as possible. So all of that is in the long range plan. It's done at a regional scale. So we're looking at city projects, county projects, state MDT, transit investments. There's a broad range of projects in the long range plan. And this is sort of the core of our strategy for how we invest in transportation as a region. So then how does that translate down into the city and how we develop our CIP? Because again, as I mentioned, the city is really one of the primary implementers of our long range transportation plan. And so how the city invests local dollars is really key. And as we get through this and we talk about funding, you'll see sort of how important local city funding is in our transportation investment. There's sort of been a national shift away from federal dollars. That federal transportation, I guess, barring our most recent infrastructure bill that has substantially increased, federal funding really isn't keeping up with need. And so that is that gap has been filled by cities and states and counties. And it's really a challenge that I think we need to be aware of. So in the CIP, again, we have a prioritization process that we developed. Ben Weiss and Jeremy and I worked on this over a couple of years. We've done some presentations on how we prioritize for the city in our CIP that's reflective of the long range plan, but really addresses what's happening at the city and how we want to invest those local dollars. Again, it's a data-driven process. We're looking at key measures, a lot of the same data that we're looking at in the long range plan. It's values-based. The city has a strategic priorities, and we want to be advancing those in our CIP investments. Again, it's focused on outcomes, and it's trying to look comprehensive at what can we get done and how do these projects relate. So very similar to what we do in the long range plan, but really focused on the city specific projects. So we've got this matrix that we have set up that helps us prioritize projects. So when you see CIP projects coming forward for funding, they have already gone through this whole process, and it's really focused on trying to make sure we're making the most impactful investments, that there is a way to evaluate the trade-offs of different funding scenarios. So there are a number of criteria we use that include plan conformity. How well do each of these plans conform with our various plans, whether that's the affordable housing policy, our climate action plans, our transportation plans, growth policy, how well do each of these projects meet the goals of those various plans? We're looking at connectivity, so making sure we're completing connections, not just putting in, here's an improvement out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't provide any connectivity to any other project. We want to look at access and accessibility, that really, what are these projects serving? Are we serving schools and parks, regional destinations? Are they providing accessibility improvements for people with disabilities? All of those aspects of access. We're also looking at safety and equity as the two sort of what we heard from council are two of the most important criteria for these projects. And so those are weighted a little bit heavier in our scoring. That's looking at, what are the safety benefits of the project in terms of all of the users of the roadway, and then equity. Are we making investments that really address known inequalities in our community, whether that's neighborhoods that have seen historic lack of investment, areas where we have health disparities, income disparities, all of those aspects of equity that we can try to address through transportation investments. And then there are a couple of categories that we really need to look at projects, because this comes into when we have funding available. We want to try to fund projects that are ready, because that reduces our costs. We can get things on the ground and build. And then we want to look at leverage. Do we have opportunities for public-private partnerships? Are there other investments that are going to help us make these projects more efficient, so that we're maximizing the use of our dollars. So when we go through that, we create this long list. We have a table of about 80 or 90 projects now. Anytime we get input from either those of you on city council who hear from constituents that we have a need for a project in a location, or as we start to develop new project ideas, we put them into this scoring so we can really say, is this a high priority project? Where does this fall in relation to other projects? So we're not being as reactive or just jumping at a project because it's sort of the highlight of the day, that we're being really intentional about how we start moving projects forward and are doing it in a way that is outcome driven, and based on that prioritization process. So this is an example of kind of what that looks like when you start ranking projects. These are the first 10 or 12 projects on the list in our CIP. They're broken into a number of different categories, and I'll talk about these a little bit later, but just looking at different kinds of projects and how they relate to each other. So we might have trail projects, complete streets, specific intersections, neighborhood greenways. They're all kind of put into one big matrix where we're looking at the benefits of each of these different kinds of projects. And you'll see there's a good diversity of different projects that score very highly on this matrix. And if a lot of these projects look really familiar, it's because these are what we are advancing in our CIP, these highest scoring projects in our CIP list or our potential project list. So that's prioritization. That is how we come up with our lists of projects and what we want to fund, and in a general order of how we want to fund them in terms of priority. But there's also a process once we start identifying which projects we want to fund of developing those from these lines on a map. Looking at this, we've got a number of projects identified. We know generally where it is, but what does that project include? What are the elements that we're going to fund, and how does that reflect on the cost of the project? So there's a process we go through, and we developed this graphic a couple of years ago that I think is helpful to understand how projects start from an idea or what we call sort of community needs. Looking at new parks, new trails, we're looking at streets, all of these things that are needs out in the community. How do we go from that identification of a need down all the way through sort of this, they call it the sausage making of how a project gets to construction and implementation. And they all start as a community need. There's a deficiency in transportation, or there's an identified safety issue. And we go through this process of starting with the planning, thinking about the long range plan, going through prioritization that we've done. And then as we get into the projects, when we start funding them, there's still additional steps. We have to go through the design process. We're looking at what available funding we have. What is the community specific vision for that specific project? What are the safety issues? What are the goals that we have for that project? And then even through the construction and execution, there's still more process there of getting those designs, the engineering, and all of the work that goes into a project before we see it go to construction and implemented. And then even beyond this, we have the maintenance. That's, we often just don't even talk about how projects get maintained, but every new project we do creates a potential future maintenance expense. And so that's part of how we develop these projects. So starting with, as we have available funding, project development starts with looking at our prioritization list. So what are the projects at the top of the list? A good example, as sort of walk through these, I'll use two projects as an example of how we go through this process. And those are Eaton Street, which you'll be seeing. It's in our CIP. We have a presentation next week on sort of the first phase of this project that we're getting close to construction. And then Turner Warden North 5th is another complete street project that is sort of in the project development process. So you can see these are this is a page from our long range transportation plan, which are our near-term priority projects. You can see those two projects were identified as a near-term priority. They have a high benefit. They score really well. They meet a lot of our plan goals. And so they landed in that sort of high priority, high scoring projects, which is one of the reasons that we have them in development. We then look at our city CIP list. Those projects are also in our sort of the top of the list in the city's CIP prioritization. So you'll notice that Eaton is the number 2 sidewalk project in our list. Turner Warden North 5th is the 4th highest scoring. And so these are really high scoring projects in our city CIP process as well, which is why you will see them in funding. A lot of these other projects are also being funded right now. So it's not always the number 1 project on the list is the one that's going to construction next. The West Side area replacement, we're still in sort of planning and concept development. It's just not ready for construction. And so you sort of work your way down to Eaton Street, which is really the sidewalk or complete street project that is the most ready for implementation right now. So this is where that kind of leverage and readiness comes into play when we're going from prioritization to actual funding and project development. And you'll notice that on these lists, we have different categories of projects. So in the long range plan, we have active transportation, complete streets, roadway, new roadways or extensions, safety projects. And it's a little bit different in our city CIP. We have a little bit more detail where we're breaking out for active transportation. It might be a sidewalk project, or really these are complete streets. Because you're never just building sidewalk, you're always rebuilding the street to some extent. But we also have trails, we have neighborhood greenways, we have spot improvements that are those safety intersection improvements. And then we have sort of full reconstruction that might be a road widening, a new road, like the Build Grant, where we're just building brand new facilities. So there's similarities between these two, but they get a little bit different because there's just more specificity at the city level that we need to develop a CIP. So then once we've identified projects, we know we want to fund it, we go through a number of different steps. There's sort of our planning level estimate and planning level where we know generally this is what we want to achieve. It's a sidewalk or complete street project. And we know this is where it is. We come up with a really rough planning level estimate. So these numbers are example from Eaton Street. So I think this is a helpful one to look at as we go into discussions more specifically on Eaton and contract items next week. But our planning estimate was about $1.5 million for both phases of Eaton. So that's Eaton Street from 7th all the way to South Avenue. When we once we identified this as our highest priority project and we wanted to fund it, we started going into the concept design and getting more, really dialing in the scope, looking at all the challenges on the project, getting a better idea. Once we did that work and started looking at issues like we've got irrigation ditches that may require bridges, and we have sort of specific intersections that we have to address, that cost estimate based on that conceptual work went up to about $1.9 million. Some of that is increased cost inflation. Some of it is just having a better idea of what's included in the project. But at the end of the day, projects really never get cheaper, or very rarely. So we started refining our project estimates. And at this point, we're doing neighborhood outreach, talking to adjacent property owners, trying to really identify what some of our constraints and impacts are, and making sure we still have that good public involvement as we develop the project, and we're mitigating our impacts on the adjacent property owners and achieving the goals for the neighborhood and for the city. And then as we continue to develop that project and get the engineering done and really figuring out all of the specific details for this project, we've divided it into phases based on available funding. So we're now at about almost $1.2 million just for that first phase. And this is something I think is really important to think about as we go into the funding piece, that projects are getting really expensive. And also that it's, we talk about sidewalk projects, and I want to reinforce this here, that when we talk about a sidewalk project, it's really a complete street because there is a lot of other work that goes into these projects. So included some photos here that I think will help illustrate that from Grant Street. This is a project we did a couple of years ago. We called it a sidewalk project, but really it's a complete street. We're doing curb work. We're doing new sidewalks, we're doing boulevards. There's a lot of street work. Often we're repaving streets at the same time that we're doing the sidewalk projects. So we're touching the full width of the right of way on these projects. And it's not just putting in sidewalk panels. So I think when we look at the costs of these projects, it's really important to consider that it's not just sidewalk panels. There's a lot of work that goes into these, and this work is getting increasingly more expensive. So all of that's a quick overview of project development. there's a lot more detail we could go into there if you have questions about how we design and what standards we're using for projects. But I think it's at this point, I want to talk about the funding, because this is where, if you will, the rubber meets the road in terms of what we can actually get done and why we have to struggle through prioritization so much. So in the long range plan is fiscally constrained. And what that means is we project out revenue over 20 or 30 years. And we look at to see, what do we anticipate having available at sort of a conservative estimate over that 30-year period. We combine both federal and local dollars, and then we sort of take out like what's already dedicated to roadway maintenance, what funding is programmed by the state and we don't really have much control over in terms of how some of those federal dollars are spent. And that really gets us down to what is available for doing these transportation improvements. And in our current long range plan, we have about $210 million over that 30-year period for kind of these new projects that we're prioritizing. Again, and this graphic is showing a breakdown of sort of how we're spending that. So over 50% is on those complete street projects. So that could be like Eaton, Turner, Warden are both considered complete streets. South Avenue, a number of these projects we're working on are part of that $112 million that we think we'll have available for complete streets. Then we also have some new roadways. The build grant, for example, is building out some new roadway extensions. We have some specific active transportation. Our neighborhood greenways are a good example of that. A couple of new bridge projects, intersection improvements. There's sort of a diversity of projects, but not that much money. $210 million over 30 years is not enough. We have, I think, over $600 million worth of identified need in the region, and we have that $210 million to put towards it. Or maybe it's $600 million above and beyond that $210 million. In any case, we're vastly underfunded based on the need that we have in the region. And I think you all are aware of that. This comes up a lot in development projects, and hopefully this provides some context about why we're doing the projects we are when we're thinking about those sort of potential impacts or improvements that we might see. So this is where I think it's when we start talking about what our funding sources are, and this is something in the long range plan that I think was really illuminating on what the city's role is in implementing our transportation plan. When you look at the breakdown of that available $210 million, the vast majority of it is local funding. We just don't have that much discretionary federal funding that we as a region have the ability to program. So about 3/4 of that funding, almost, or 2/3, is coming from local sources like gas tax, impact fees, tax increment financing, that we don't have nearly as much federal funding as we would like to implement some of these projects. And a lot of our local discretionary funding is wrapped up in one large project. Russell Street has been taking the bulk of our discretionary federal fund at the MPO level for about 10 or 20 years. And we've got another 6 or 7 to go before that project's paid off. So it's really been a big impact on our ability to do some of these more localized projects. So city funding is really important in implementing our plan. And we have a number of sources. We have gas tax that we collect, that's sort of state collected, and then we get a allocation of that. There is road district, which is a property tax. We have impact fees, and then we have tax increment financing, which is another sort of form of property tax that we can invest. So fairly limited sources, but is the bulk of what we have to program and implement our goals over the next 20 or 30 years. On the federal funding side, I won't spend too much time on this, but it's helpful to understand at City Council how we program federal funds. Those happen at the MPO level, approves all of the federal funding, but that's a mix of sources like our surface transportation urban funds. Those the MPO gets the program, but you'll see it's all Russell Street for the next 5 years. Probably even beyond this, that we will be investing in Russell Street through about 2027 or 2028. So there's one discretionary source. We get almost $2 million a year. It's all going to Russell Street. A lot of those other federal funds get programmed at the state level, and then they bring those projects to the MPO for approval. But we don't really get to say what those funds go towards, other than we can sort of say yes or no, we think that's a priority or not. but we don't get to say what they should be funded or what they should get put towards, other than sort of an advisory, and we have input and a seat at the table, I guess. But those decisions are being made by MDT ultimately. If anyone's interested, I put a link in this, and I'll share this presentation on the agenda. But you can go to the MPO's website, look through this transportation improvement program, see all the projects that are being funded at the MPO level through the federal funding. So before I get into the city's funding, one of the things we're seeing through the last 10 or 20 years is that costs are quickly outpacing our revenue. And this is definitely true at the city level. We'll see that as we look through some rough estimates of what our historical funding levels are or how that's changed over time. But you can see this starting in the mid 2000s, construction costs have gone up considerably, and our gas tax revenue and other sources is staying relatively flat. There's some growth there, you get a little bit more, but we're seeing this increased gap that we have to fund, that we're either having to do more with less, or we're just doing less because we don't have enough funding. And this is really important as we think about what we're funding and why we're funding as little as why we're doing as little as we are because of that gap. So locally, we've got a couple of funding sources that are really important here that we have to work with. As I mentioned, we have impact fees. And similar to that graphic that I just showed you, where revenues are staying flat, you've got your impact fees have gone up a little bit in the last couple of years. That was primarily in part due to more development that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of development activity that helps on impact fees. And we also had a small increase, but you can see in the last couple of years in our projections, those are, not increasing at the same rate as our costs. We also have gas tax. So gas tax, the state gas tax, which is primarily used for our roadway maintenance, has stayed fairly flat. So those costs are going up. Our revenues are generally not going up with it. And then we have BARSA, which is another state gas tax that we can use for construction projects. It went up pretty substantially and between 2019 and 2021 as that gas tax was phased in. But it also we're seeing a little bit of increase, but it's not going up that fast. And then road district, which is our property tax that goes towards those sidewalk complete street projects, has been essentially flat for the last 4 or 5 years. So we're not increasing that funding at a city level really at all. That we've had about $430,000 a year to put towards those projects, and that hasn't changed. So we have, I guess, takeaways here that we have few local options. This is basically what we have available: our property taxes, gas tax, and impact fees. Gas tax, we don't have any control over. The state sets those rates, and we get sort of a population, or we get an allocation of that, but we don't really get as much as we put in because some of that gets transferred over to Eastern Montana and lower density parts of the state. So low growth, few options, and property tax is really where we have the most flexibility in terms of how much we are putting into transportation. And all of these are growing slow. So this is, in comparison, this is another graphic looking at what's called the National Highway Construction Cost Index. So this is looking at how construction costs are growing in relation to the previous year. And you can see there, it's going up at compare this, how costs are increasing with our revenue. And you'll see why we have the challenges that we do in transportation and why we have to be very strategic in what we're building. So funding's flat, costs inflation is going up very rapidly. Just in the last couple of years, you see this really big spike. We're seeing this likely to continue for the foreseeable future. We have about 90 projects in our current city CIP list. That's over $100 million. That I think is a very low end estimate with what we're seeing in cost inflation. That's likely much higher. Our revenue for construction projects is about $2 to $3 million a year. So put that into perspective with, let me go back to this. So what we're seeing in just phase 1 of Eaton Street is over $1 million. That is for about 10 blocks, maybe less than 10 blocks. I can't remember, but from 7th to 14th, so 7 blocks. costs us about a little over $1 million. We're seeing the same thing on all of these projects that costs are going up very substantially. So we're very revenue constrained, costs continue to go up. And then just the funding sources and how we do these sidewalk and complete street projects where, you know, we just don't have a lot of opportunity to look at different funding sources. So we currently are funding between road district and property assessment. So we have that property assessment program on these projects for the sidewalk. And we have some gas tax that we put into that as well. But here's what we would like to target to be able to even just try to keep up with construction. Here's where we're at currently. So when you don't see a lot of sidewalk projects coming through, this is really why. And it's a challenge. And I don't know that there's any great solutions out there, but I think it's worth being aware of that this is where we're at. I guess not wanting to end on a total dire, everything is failing. We do have the infrastructure bill that has substantially increased infrastructure funding. I think we're seeing a lot of those increases in funding get absorbed by inflation, but there are a lot of discretionary grant programs that I think Missoula, because of the planning work we've done and the goals that we have, are really well in very close alignment with what the federal government is wanting to fund. And so we have a big opportunity in the next 5 years to try to get as much done as possible through those discretionary grant programs. And I think that will really help us. And then, I think we need to really consider how we're developing and what that development costs in terms of new infrastructure, because maintenance is also getting increasingly expensive. And if we have to, the more money we have to divert into maintenance, the less we have for retrofitting facilities, like doing those complete street reconstructions, doing sidewalk projects, because we're just having to maintain what we have, and that is also a challenge. So I think the more efficiently we grow, the more revenue we get per mile of street or mile of sidewalk or trail or whatever, what have you. And we also want to we're being very strategic in terms of how, when we talk about mode split and those goals, that this is exactly why to widen a street costs a ton of money. And as I mentioned, you're widening 1 mile of street, you're not doing the entire rest of the network. So the more we can emphasize sort of maximizing use of our existing facilities in terms of increasing bike trips, transit, walking, all of those things will help us address these deficiencies that we're seeing. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do more with less, but certainly we're very constrained in our project funding. So that's all I have. That's a lot of information at a very high level, but maybe I'll stop here, see what questions we have, if there's an area we want to focus on. Or I also have some other slides if we want to talk about some other peripheral things. But I'll stop there, see what everyone thinks, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Aaron. Take a drink of water.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's a lot of talk.
Thank you. That was a really good comprehensive look at how decisions are made and how what we see before us. It took a long process to get to decision-making point, a lot of public input and a lot of really good filtering, if you will, through all those lenses that we have set as priorities. So I appreciate that. Okay, I see a couple of hands up, Amber and then Daniel.
Thanks, Aaron. And I thought you were going to end on a positive note. I was waiting.
That was the federal. We've got a lot of funding out there. I mean, there are opportunities that we have to address this. It's not all dire in the future.
Yeah, right. But I don't like your cost versus funding projections. That's a little that does feel a little dire. I have a comment and then a question, if that's okay, Mirta. So, I mean, my comment was just something I wrote much earlier in the presentation, is I really like with the long range transportation plan, your prioritization. I mean, when I look at the idea of like collect, screen, score, assess, prioritize, it's just a smart way to do it. And I know that this is so complicated every time you come in here and we're like, wait, we want that. Wait, we want that. Cause we all want a bunch of it. And, we're all advocating for our wards, of course, but it is good to have this and see this bigger picture. There's also been a lot of conversation around equity and sidewalks and how we fund those. And I think, the idea of looking at what you're talking about here and how cost burdensome it is, and thinking about what that would add to property taxes to completely fund sidewalks, which I wish I could just snap my fingers and the entire city would have them, because I have personal experience with someone in a wheelchair that is, I feel that. I mean, they're basically homebound if you can't get them onto the sidewalk sometimes. So those are just some comments, I guess. With the infrastructure bill and funding, and can you just talk about how that filters down to us, how competitive it's going to be? I mean, I know you don't know all those things, but I'm, just with the Setupcane master plan and getting that money, and I know we put in for a lot more, and are going to be putting in again, and so that number is great, and that's a lot of money, and I'm thrilled that passed. But it is competitive, and I'd like to hear a little more about how that process is and your thoughts on it.
Well, at this point, I think the process is just sort of a scramble to try to keep up. We're seeing new notices of funding opportunity come out about every month to 2 months. And I suspect we'll continue to see that for the next 4 to 6 months. And then next year, it's all going to repeat over. All these are annual programs. And there's a lot of money out there. So for example, RAISE, which is sort of the new build, which was Tiger in previous administrations, that program is now funded at, I think, close to $2 or $3 billion a year. It used to be just under $1 billion or maybe $1.5 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but I think they get, a couple $100 billion in applications. So it's very competitive. But when we look at the things that they're really focused on, it's creating multimodal systems, which is exactly what we're trying to do in Missoula. And we've been planning for that for years. We're very well established for that. They're focused on equity, which is, again, something that we are also very focused on. And they're really looking at safety, which we are also very, we have really good data, and we're doing a lot around safety. So the things, and then I guess, sustainability and climate, both climate adaptation, resiliency, climate change mitigation. We are also doing all of those things. And so I think we'll be very competitive for these programs. Obviously, we're not going to get funding for every project we submit, but we have 5 years worth of grants that are going to continue to come out every couple of months. And so I think we will get funding from those programs. And so that's something to be optimistic about, where I think we can be very competitive based on the planning work that we've done, and by virtue of just sort of how Missoula is developing and what opportunities we have, that we're geographically constrained. We're not really able to just build ever outward like some other communities are. And so I think we've been forced to be more strategic and creative with how we address transportation, which fits very well into what the current federal government and the direction we're seeing is focused on. So I think that's part of that positive story, that I think we're on the right track, and we're doing the right things to access that funding and to be more efficient.
Yeah, thanks. Mirta, may I have a follow-up?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And that's one of the points I was going to ask. I think you kind of just answered my next question a little bit, was just, to point out how important all of this strategy and planning is in order to be competitive for both state and federal dollars. We are always approving, what sometimes seems to be really expensive planning efforts around the city. But, those come back to us many times, many-fold. I don't know how many fold, so I'm not gonna say that number, but and I guess I think you kind of said this, but are there other things that you feel like as a municipality we could be investing in that would would make us more competitive for this money, because it is a lot of, you don't have to answer that on the fly. It's just something I always think about. I know you're really good at doing that and thinking about that, but as a council, setting us up to be the most competitive to get that type of money is really important, especially in the tax structure that we currently operate under.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that comes immediately to mind, especially given, you had a code reform update presentation this morning, the land use decisions that we make probably have a bigger impact on transportation than just about anything else we will do. And so being really thoughtful that there's a lot of ways that land use influences not just our competitiveness for grants, but our ability to be more efficient. So thinking about, developing at higher density isn't just sort of a desire for no reason. That the more dense you have development, you have more people paying for the same mile of roadway or transportation facility. And so, if property tax is our revenue source that we have control over, you are maximizing sort of the amount, or you're minimizing the amount that each individual household has to pay towards that building and maintenance of roadways. So density has a direct relationship to how much each household has to pay towards our transportation system. It also increases the ability for the closer things are, when we talk about walkability, that's every trip that someone is walking, they are not driving, it's more efficient. You're using space more efficiently, it costs less. And so increased density, you get better mix of uses, you have more walking and biking trip opportunities, transit can be more efficient and effective. So you're really, again, maximizing your investment and your long-term maintenance costs. So I think that's something that will make us really competitive. And we've been doing that, I think, reasonably well. But as you go through this code update process, be really thoughtful about the decisions we make on land use development pattern has a direct relationship to how much our transportation system costs. And so that's something where I think we could really focus and we can help close some of these gaps that we're seeing in terms of our available revenue versus the need that we have in transportation investment.
Thanks, Aaron. May I make a comment, Mirta?
Yeah.
And then I'll be quiet. I don't mean to take, that's really great. And I appreciate I appreciate that advice for us, because I think it's really, really good to remember kind of how many different things that this code reform is going to affect and could affect. And I just want to say, as a note, I was in a meeting with you years ago, maybe the first time that I ever met you, but around the county, and we were talking about before the Setupcane master plan kind of came out, and it seemed like there was a lot of density to me, and you were like, that's not enough to make public transportation make sense financially. And I was really struck by that, because the density seemed really high to me, but having those numbers work and having that transportation piece and work it's really interesting. It's really complicated, and it takes more density than what you would think if you're not a transportation person.
Thanks, Amber. I just wanted to add that, development in places where we already have infrastructure is, certainly going to help us reduce the amount of funding that we need to expand and maintain infrastructure in the long term. So being really thoughtful about where we add extra development and density is, I think, important to consider from a transportation perspective. And I also wanted to point out that a lot of times what makes us more competitive for grants is being able to be shovel ready, or being at least having a plan in place. And so that's why I think when we approve all these planning efforts for Higgins or for any of the major corridors in the city, it's important for us to know what it is that we want to accomplish and how much money it will take for us to do so that when we apply for a grant, we know what it is that we want to get and push really hard to get that much funding. So those plans are really important in making us more competitive, I think. Daniel, thanks for waiting.
No problem. Yep. Yeah, I was just going to ask about if we have a chart or of different funding sources for like materials. Like it seems like sidewalks are super expensive nowadays of concrete, and that concrete's also a big emitter of greenhouse gases. And I'm just curious if we can justify using these materials going forward, or if there's other options that we've looked into with like cost, how long they last, things like that. Just because I feel like as a society, we're hopefully moving away from concrete eventually. But I know we need something that lasts long, and I think we might have cheaper options. So I was just curious if you had any updates on that.
Yeah, not really. When we did our pedestrian facilities master plan, we did some research on other materials, construction options, and really concrete is the best option from a durability perspective and accessibility. We want our pedestrian facilities to be accessible. So, like gravel doesn't work very well if you're in a wheelchair or using other mobility devices, or if you have a vision disability. Some of the other, there's other new materials out there that so like permeable pavers and things that some of them cost quite a bit more than concrete does, and they have pretty high maintenance costs. So you need like special equipment, or they actually have to be maintained in a way that sidewalks don't. So that permeability goes away if you're not actively maintaining them. So it's a challenge. I mean, I hope, I'm right there with you that, if we could move away from concrete to something that's more affordable and more sustainable, I think we absolutely would do that. There just hasn't been a lot of advancement that we've seen on that front. Certainly not that would make it cheaper and as durable.
Good follow up.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just curious if there was like if there was any examples like in Missoula, like I've seen like red sidewalks over on 39th Street and things like that. Is it clay anywhere, or brick sidewalks? Or I guess brick would not be very accessible, but yeah, I guess it's just something I'll look into and try and touch base with you.
Yeah, reach out. And if you look at our pedestrian facilities master plan, one of the appendices is sort of a list of all of the other, at that time, that was about 5 or 6 years ago, 5 years ago, seems like not that long, or maybe it's 4 years ago. But we had a list of sort of things that we looked at and what the pros and cons are. And so that's a good place to start. But yeah, reach out and we can chat about. And we're always looking, I think, for new opportunities to test stuff out. It just, there haven't been a lot in the last couple of years or decades.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Hopefully I don't want this to come across as necessarily depressing and like the sky is falling. Just that we have those challenges, and it sort of reinforces the need to be really creative, and we're doing those things, and sort of this is a reinforcement for why we're doing those things and why we're focused on those, that there is a reason for it. So
no, I think you painted a clear picture of what we're dealing with, and I think it's also important to remember that it's really tricky to plan for something, but also be flexible, especially on our CIPs. We can take advantage of opportunities when they arise so that we can be more cost effective. So it's a balancing act on so many fronts, for sure. Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Aaron. I skew toward being optimistic and positive, but the house has been on fire from an infrastructure funding standpoint for decades, with the gas tax being frozen at the federal level, with it not keeping pace at the state level, with the state legislature taking away our local option voter passed local option gas tax that Missoula County voters passed. And I think you said it earlier on that, we've been trying to do more with less, and at some point we have to do less with less. And if we do less with less, our streets deteriorate and our sidewalks deteriorate to the point where they have to be completely replaced instead of rehabilitated. So it's really problematic, and I'm glad. I mean, we need to keep talking about it, because that's the only way we're going to draw attention to this issue is by talking about it. On that note, I do want to thank Senator Tester for his role in crafting and spearheading the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I think that is going to make it's going to make meaningful impact. You know, we need to do more, but it's going to start making meaningful impact. It's a model that we should hopefully follow and expand upon in the future. So thank you, Aaron, for, as always, a really great, informative, well put together presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. And like I said, if there's any of this that you want to, you know, even if it comes to you in the days or weeks ahead, you know, that you want to have more of a discussion on, let me know. I'm always happy to try to dig up more data or dive into these things. There's certainly a lot to drill down on if we really want to.
And Aaron, is the presentation available on link to the agenda? I can't remember.
Not yet, because I was finishing it this morning. So, yeah. But I'll get it linked to the agenda after this meeting.
I think that'd be great, just as a reference for the future.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That was really good and comprehensive. I appreciate it. If there is, let me see, for no one is in the public for any public comment. If there are no other questions or comments, I think that is it. And we would be adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.